Testing. Hello, everyone. I see a lot of comments already, people joining. Welcome. I'd love for you all to put in the chat where you are from. I am coming from Atlanta today. Welcome, everyone. So first, I'd love to know where everyone is from, but then has anyone already officially registered to take the Claude certification exam? If you have, just go ahead and drop it in the chat. But let's go ahead and kick off. So today I'm going to be sharing about getting certified for the Claude Certified Architecture Exam. I will share from my experience a lot of my lessons learned. So anytime you have questions, just drop them in the chat. I am monitoring the chat, so you don't have to hold your questions until the end. I see Emmanuel from New Jersey. I see Victoria from the UK. People from all over the world. Lakeland, Florida. Welcome, Jasmine. Krista coming in from Phoenix. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So we have a lot to cover today, so let's just jump right in. And like I said, any questions you have, drop them in the chat. I'm monitoring the chat. If you haven't seen my work before, if you don't know me, my name is Keisha Williams. I've been in tech for about 30 years. I am the head of AI at a company called Keysoft. We help startups and enterprises deploy Claude solutions, Claude and AWS solutions. We've mainly helped drive AI adoption, improving engineering practices, and we also host certified learning cohorts. So there's an upcoming cohort for the Claude Certified Architect. That will be the last cohort for this year. So let's jump right in. During our time together, this is what you will be learning about. I'll share how the exam thinks, and I will give you one hot tip per domain. And then we'll talk about the 6 exam scenarios, and then we'll combine all of that into just one live architecture review. And then we'll have a question walkthrough. So I will give you just sample questions from each domain, and we'll work through and think through how you would answer those questions together. And then at the end, I'll give you a study path for the time that you have left to help you study for your exam. So, what does the exam look like? First, there is a very detailed exam guide that I recommend that you read from front to back more than once because it's one of the better exam guides that I've seen, and it does a really good job at explaining what you will be tested on the exam. At a very high level, you will have 60 questions and 2 hours to complete the exam. When I took the exam, I felt that 2 hours was very reasonable. And I'll get into this later about my approach and how I went through the exam. You have to have 720 out of 1,000 in order to pass. And the domains are weighted. There are 5 domains. So that means there are some domains that are more important than others. And then the format is all scenario based. So domain one is agentic architecture. That's 27% of the exam. So a lot of questions come from that domain. And then domain two is tool design and MCP, the model context protocol. That's about 18%. Um, Domain three is Claude code at 20%. Domain four is prompt and structured output. That's 20%. And domain five is context and reliability at 15%. Emmanuel has a question about the detailed guide. It is available on the Anthropic website. I'll be able to put a link in the chat, but you can find it on the same place where you register. There is a very detailed exam guide that shows you and explains everything on the exam. Now, going into this exam, and I've taken a lot of certification exams, mainly in the AWS space. What I like about this exam is that most of the questions come from real production scenarios. And in the exam guide, and we'll go over this, they give you the 6 scenarios that will appear on the exam. So it's really important for you to understand those 6 scenarios. And like I said, a lot of the questions are based on those 6 scenarios, and it's very realistic production situations that you'll run into as you're building systems with Claude. So the first domain, and I'm off screen so that the portion of the slide is not cut off that you all need to read. For the first domain, it's agentic architecture and orchestration. And so this section is all about designing that agentic loop and how you control the flow. And it's also about multi-agent architecture. So coordinating systems where you have one main coordinator agent that then spawns sub-agents to do specific tasks. And that third bullet point is talking about the sub-agent invocation. There are a lot of settings that you have to have in place in order for your sub-agent to be able to spawn sub-agents. One of those is having the task tool. So that's something that you'll need to learn and understand. You'll also need to understand how you enforce multi-step workflows. And we'll get deeper into this, but there are programmatic ways and gates that you can put in place, and you need to learn all about that. And then you need to understand the concept of a hook. A hook is a guardrail, and it basically, when you're working with multiple agents, it's a way to just make sure something happens before a specific task fires off. And I'll dig deeper into that when we look at the real architecture example. And then just being able to take complex work and decompose it into smaller tasks, that feeds back into that multi-agent architecture where you have that one coordinator agent that has this big task and it decomposes it and spawns sub-agents. And then you need to understand how to manage your session state. And I see someone put in the chat a link to the certification exam guide. Thank you for putting that out there for people. Now let's talk about the next domain. And this domain is all about tool design and MCP integration. So, at a very high level, when you think about a tool allows an agent to do some type of action. And the tools are usually exposed through an MCP server. So, for example, if you have a coding agent and it's connected into the GitHub MCP server, it can do things like list your repositories. That is a tool call. It can do things like commit code, open a PR, merge to a particular branch. Those are all tool calls. So, as a part of studying for the exam, you really need to understand how you design tools and really narrowing in on the most important features of a tool, and that would be the description. Because when you're building an agentic system, the tool description is mainly how the model decides that that tool is the tool that it needs to call in order to do its job. So descriptions need to be very clear. And then also going into tool design and MCP integration, you need to learn about returning structured errors, and we'll talk more about that. So just not returning prose like long text, but returning things in JSON format. So always think about system to system communication and how systems typically communicate. They send data using the JSON format. So remember that going into the exam. And then distributing tools across agents and really only giving agents the specific tools that they need access to. In best practices, it's typically 4 to 5 tools that you'll give an agent. The more tools that you give it, sometimes it will really get confused and not know which tool is the right tool to call. So 4 to 5 is the best practice. You'll also need to understand how you integrate MCP servers and how you apply built-in tools like the read tool, the write tool, the edit tool, bash, grep, and glob. So just understanding those tools. And then Claude Code, that's domain 3. So understanding how to set up Claude Code and configuring it in workflows. So the first is this Claude.md. And going into the exam, you need to understand what that's used for, and you need to understand the different types of Claude.mds you can have and the hierarchy. So you can have a user-specific Claude MD, so that's with your personal preferences. That's never checked in and it's not shared across a team. You can have a project level Claude.md that's checked into version control and shared across your team. You can also have a directory level Claude.md. So understanding that going into the exam is really important. And then how to create slash commands, how to create skills, how to apply path scoped rules, understanding the difference between plan mode versus direct execution. If you've worked a lot in Claude Code, you'll see the option to flip between plan mode or just the direct execution mode. Plan mode is usually useful when you have complex changes that need to happen. And I use that mode a lot when I'm working with Claude Code because I want to see what changes will it make before it actually makes those changes. So going into the exam, you really need to understand when you would choose one over the other. You would also need to understand how you refine your prompts and how you use the interview pattern. So the interview pattern is really good when you're not sure about how to structure the prompt. And so instead, you give Claude the problem and then you ask it to interview you or ask you 5 questions that will help it produce a better output. And then a big one on the exam is how you wire Claude code into a CI pipeline. And that's essentially running Claude code in what's called a headless format. So understanding that. And then domain 4 is all about prompt engineering and structured output. So just understanding how you design prompts to produce the best output. You'll use things like few shot prompting where you provide targeted examples, and that's really useful when the case is very ambiguous. And then you'll also learn about how to enforce structured output. Remember, on the previous slide, I talked about the systems to system communication using the JSON format. There's a way where you can force that output to be JSON, and it's using the tool use. And you need to understand how to build validation loops. You need to understand batch processing, how that works, and the message batches API. Typically, that will give you a 50% cost savings, but the turnaround time is up to 24 hours. So you really have to understand the difference between when you would want batch processing versus real-time processing. And then the last bullet point, the architecting the multi-pass review. You need to understand that going into the exam and how that is better than just one mega prompt. The next domain is around context management and reliability. And this is 15% of the exam. So it's one of the smaller domains, but it is still important to understand how, between sessions, how you manage that context between agents. Like you have this coordinator agent that spins up a sub agent. How do you pass context from one agent to the next agent? You also need to understand how you design escalation patterns. So if there's a sub agent and there's an error, does it retry that error in itself, or does it escalate to the coordinator agent? And then also understanding when things need to be escalated to a human. And the third bullet point, propagating errors across agents. I sort of talked about that. It's really how the sub agents get that context and error messages. You need to understand how to explore large code bases. So understanding the token budgets, trimming verbose output, and you need to understand how to calibrate human review and preserving provenance. So that's more around citations. If there's a sub agent that does research, how does it preserve the URLs and the information that it found? Just checking to see if anyone has any questions, just drop them in the chat. Okay, so I've gone through and talked a lot about what is on the exam. It's also important to understand what you're not going to be tested about. So the first thing, model internals and training. So you don't have to understand about fine tuning or training custom models. That's not on the exam. You don't have to understand the internal architecture of Claude. You don't have to understand tokenization specifics. You also don't have to understand about from the platform and account operations. So the API, authentication, billing, rate limits, quotas. You don't have to worry about seeing any of that on the exam. Adjacent capabilities like Claude Computer, vision and image analysis, creating images, streaming, server-side events, embeddings, and vector databases. You don't have to worry about any of that. And then from an infrastructure standpoint, you don't really have to understand how you deploy and host MCP servers, but you do have to understand when you're architecting a system, how you like set up the MCP server so that Claude can actually access it, how you give Claude access to the tools found on that MCP server. You'll see things of that nature. You don't have to worry about benchmarking and model comparisons. So, for example, when would I want to use Sonnet over Fable? You will not see questions like that on the exam. And you do have to, from a bare bones, understand about prompt caching and why you would want to cache prompts, but you will not need to explain the internals of how that works. I see someone else joining in from Atlanta. Hello from Atlanta. So, what's important to remember that this exam is going to really, really test your judgment. Most of the questions are judgment questions. You're going to be given a scenario that is more than likely a problem that's occurring, and you're going to have to use your knowledge and your judgment to pick the best solution. And so don't try to memorize because that's not going to help you. And so if you memorize, you'll definitely struggle. But what's important is to think about each question from an architecture standpoint, not even from a developer standpoint, but from an architecture standpoint, and start to recognize the patterns so that you can better answer those questions. An important thing to remember going into the exam, you'll see a lot of questions and a lot of answers related to how you can enforce certain things. And some of those answers may say improve the prompt. That is usually never the right answer. When something has to happen 100% of the time, you need to put in programmatic ways to enforce that, deterministic ways to enforce that to make sure that it happens. And so that's what I'm saying here on the left-hand side. If you try to enforce something through a system prompt, it may work 5 out of 10 times, 6 out of 10 times, but when you're dealing with, like, financials and things of that nature, very high priority things, you need to make sure that you programmatically enforce that in the code, and we'll talk about ways to do that. I see someone coming in from Chicago and from South Africa. Welcome. And so this slide really drives home what I just mentioned about thinking about things from an architecture mindset. So you'll name, when you look at a question, you'll think about the domain. And we just talked about the 5 different domains. So you think about the domain the question is about. And then you start to think about the pattern that you see. Is this a question about tool design? Is this a question about a coordinator agent delegating to a sub agent? Is this question about an issue with how context is being managed? Is this about the validation loop? And there are several other patterns that you'll need to learn. And then typically, and this is exactly what I experienced when I sat my exam. You'll have 4 scenarios to choose from, and quickly you'll be able to eliminate 2 of the scenarios. So when I took my exam, well, you have the option to take it from home. You also have the option to go into a testing center. I always default to going in person because there's just less issues and less things to worry about. When you take the exam, you'll see, like I said, 4 options. You'll be able to quickly eliminate 2. And what I really like about the Pearson VUE testing experience, it gives you the ability to actually, as you're reading the question, to cross off answers. And so you can quickly mark off 2 of the wrong answers, like the 2 wrong answers will immediately jump out at you. But then you'll be left with 2 answers that are actually right. And so you have to then go back and read the question and pick the best of those two that answers the question. So all that to say, you'll typically be able to take the 4 and eliminate it down to 2, and then you have to pick between the 2. There's a question here from Dion. Has the partner requirement been lifted for the exam? No, not at this point. You still have to be affiliated with someone who is a partner in order to access the exam. Okay, so now let's talk about domain 1 and a quick tip that you can use going into the exam. And remember what I said about domain 1, it's the largest domain, it's 27%. And so when you're reading these questions, I see another Atlanta person. Hello, Andrew, coming in from Atlanta. So for domain 1, always ask yourself, who owns the loop? And so the tell of a right answer from a design standpoint, you have a thin coordinator. So remember we talked about, and it's called the hub and spoke design, where you have one main coordinating agent that then has a task and it spawns up sub agents to help it solve that task. So typically you'll have a thin coordinator and it's going to delegate task to sub agents. And that task, if you are using the Claude API to manage that loop as opposed to using the agent's SDK, if you're using the Claude API, you're managing that loop, you're going to look for the stop reason of end turn to say that the loop needs to exit. So never rely on the model or the system telling you, hey, I'm done. Again, you need to find the programmatic way to test whether or not something is done. And that is what I just said, the stop reason. The trap on the exam, if you see an answer that talks about there's just this one monolithic agent that is going to do it all by itself, that is usually never the correct answer. So going into the exam, I have these points at the very bottom. Understand what the stop reason is, understand how a coordinator is going to spin up sub agents, understand the task tool. That tool allows a coordinator agent to spin up sub agents. If it doesn't have access to the task tool, it can't spin up sub agents. And we talked about programmatically using hooks and decomposition and session. So just going into the exam, and even designing systems in the real world, you typically never want one monolithic agent trying to do everything. The next tip is for domain 2, which is 18% of the exam. It's around tool design and MCP integration. And I mentioned this before, the way a model determines whether or not a tool is the right tool to call is the description. And so your descriptions need to be very clear. And you can also use structured error responses that the model can act on. So if you see a question or an answer that talks about returning errors as free form text as opposed to JSON, or this one mega tool that is going to do everything for the model, those are typically telltale signs that that is not the right way to do it. And again, like I said, even in the real world, we build modular systems and we tend to stay away from monolithic systems. And so just as an architect, take that design pattern with you going into the exam. Another important thing, so for domain 3, this is a good tip. Remember, domain 3 is the Claude code configuration and workflows. It's 20% of the exam. Really understand, and I mentioned this to you before, the Claude MD hierarchy. Remember, it's user, You have user configurations in the Claude MD, user level Claude MD. You have a project level Claude MD. You have a directory level Claude MD. Just understand the precedence and how that works. Understand when to reach for plan mode. And the trap is typically where the answer is ignoring that precedence. So you really need to understand when the configuration wins. So, for example, if you are using a very user level specific Claude MD, and again, remember I said that's not checked into version control because it's your specific configurations for how you want to work with Claude. And let's say you're working on a team of 5 engineers, and one of the engineers is saying, I'm not able to see this best practice that you're using. It's typically because it's in your personal Claude MD. It's not at the project level, which is then checked in and shared with others. So just understand the hierarchy and precedence and how it works and how it could cause problems. So that is the hot tip for domain 3. And then domain 4, that's prompt engineering and structured output. So going into the exam, the hot tip, and I've mentioned this, and I'm going to continue to mention this, never trust the prompt alone. You can always put explicit criteria in the prompt. Remember, I mentioned the few shot examples, giving it to the prompt, and then a schema for the output, and then validating, then retrying. So just remember that you never, any answer that says is you just update the prompt or just tell the model to use JSON, those are typically the wrong answers because, again, you need to programmatically enforce whatever it is that you want. Domain 5, 15%. It's all about context management and reliability. So, the hot tip for this, if it's saying it works in the demo, but it breaks in production, that's typically related to a context failure. So, the exam trap, you'll see, you may see answers that just say add more context or upgrade to a larger model with a larger context window. That typically is never the right answer. And so when you have context going into the exam, you have to understand how you can manage that context, how the context is passed around in a multi-agent system, and really understand some of the failure patterns. So for example, on the bottom, I have lost in the middle. And the way I like to explain this, just imagine you're explaining something to a child and you're telling a child 10 things that you wanted to do and you're telling it all at the same time. That child may remember the very first thing you told it, and it may remember the very last thing you told it. And so that's how models work. A lot of information that's building up in that context window, whatever's in the middle, sometimes can get lost. And so just understanding how that lost in the middle effect works and just understanding how you use case fact blocks to help preserve context. So just understand all of that going into the exam. So I mentioned that there are 6 scenarios. So we talked about the 5 domains, but in addition to that, there are 6 scenarios that will show up on the exam, the potential of 6. On your specific exam, your questions will be randomly pulled from only 4 scenarios. So let's talk about those scenarios now. And it's really important for you to just understand these scenarios. And what I also like about the Pearson VUE testing, when you're taking the exam, they will show you the scenario that the question is about. And so that's why I always say it's important to understand the scenarios because they will show up on the exam. The very first scenario is around this customer support resolution agent. And I like these scenarios because these are real world scenarios. Like we are building these types of solutions for customers. And so the first here, you have a Claude agent and it's handling like returns, billing disputes, account issues, and it's doing that all through MCP. And remember, I gave the example of the GitHub MCP server and how an agent can call tools. So for this customer support resolution agent, it has access to an MCP server that gives it tools called Get Customer, Lookup Order, Process Refund, and Escalate to a human. The goal of the agent is 80% first contact resolution while really understanding when to escalate to a human. So you'll see questions on your exam from this scenario. You'll also see questions from this second scenario, this code generation with Claude Code. And if you've ever used Claude Code, these questions should be pretty straightforward. So for this scenario, it's a team working together that's using Claude Code to generate new code, refactor existing code, debugging and testing and documentation. And then it needs that wired into a workflow using custom slash commands, the Claude MD configuration, and then understanding the clear sense of when to use plan mode versus direct execution. So you'll have questions coming from this scenario. The third scenario is a multi-agent research system. So think about that whole multi-agent architecture that we just talked about with the hub and spoke. And so here we have a coordinator that is going to delegate to specialized sub-agents. One sub-agent is going to be the research agent that's researching the web. One agent is going to analyze documents. One is going to synthesize, and one is going to write the report. So just going into the exam, understand this multi-agent system, how it's architected, and the different sub-agents. Scenario 4 is developer productivity with Claude. And so you'll see examples on using Claude to explore unfamiliar code bases, understand legacy systems, generate boilerplate code, and automate repetitive work. What's really important is to understand the built-in tools, and I mentioned them. So understand what the read tool is, the write tool, bash, grep, and glob. So understand those tools going into the exam. Scenario 5. Anyone that knows me knows this is my favorite scenario on the exam. So this is where you're actually running Claude Code headless in a CI pipeline. And so you really have to understand a lot of the different configuration parameters like the -p, -print, when you would want to use those and why. So understand running Claude from the CLI. And in this scenario, it's using Claude for automated code reviews, test generation, and pull request feedback. And the design goal is just actionable feedback and minimizing false positives. So understand that scenario. And if you're lucky, you will not have that scenario on your exam. And then the last scenario, 6, structured data extraction. So this is just a system that extracts information from unstructured documents, validates the output against a JSON schema, and holds high accuracy. So understand that scenario going into the exam. And so this is just one real architecture that combines all of the domains at once. So let's walk through this and then we'll get more interactive when we look at sample exam questions. So for this first question, can I get a refund on order 82287? So that's the message that's going to come in. from the user. They want this refund on the order. So that question is going to go to this coordinator, that coordinator agent. And that agent is going to decompose that task and it's going to route to the specific sub agent. And so in this case, it has three sub agents and it's going to fan those agents out in parallel. And it's going to look, the first one agent is going to be the customer lookup agent. The second sub-agent is the order lookup agent, and then the third sub-agent is the policy check agent. So notice those sub-agents each have a specific task that they are handling. And so they're calling tools as well. So the customer lookup agent is going to call this get customer tool. The order lookup is going to call the lookup order tool, and the policy check is actually going to call the process refund tool. And notice that it's gated. So there's a programmatic gate, and I'll talk about that. And then what the coordinator agent is going to do is going to get all of the responses back from these sub agents. It's going to bring back one reply. And in this case, it was approved. And so the user's request for the refund was approved. That's the answer coming back. And now look down here where it talks about hooks. Remember, I said the hook is a programmatic way to make sure something happens before something else happens. So in this case, process refund is gated. It's gated and protected by a hook. And so in this case, we don't want that process refund tool to be called unless the customer has been verified. And so we would put in place what's called a pre-tool use hook, and that's how we protect and gate this process refund. And then we have schemas that shape every result. So the communication is using JSON schemas, not just natural language text that comes back from the sub agents. And then we have certain configurations. So for example, there's a specific refund policy that we have in place. And that policy might say, if the order is over $250, then you need to escalate that to a human. And so that is just a quick look at one flow that combines all of the different domains that you'll see on the exam. I see another question. Will the slide deck and recording of this video be available? Yes, I'll make the slide deck and the recording available. So we sort of talked about this. You'll see like the 4 answers. You can go through and eliminate them. And then budgeting, typically the way I did my exam, you get 2 hours. The first hour, I made sure to go through all of the questions on the exam, and I flagged the ones that I wasn't too sure about. And so that first hour, I made sure to get through all the questions, and then going into that second hour, the ones that I flagged, I took maybe about 30 minutes to go back in and go through the ones that I flagged. And then for the last 10 to 15 minutes, I just did a quick pass, and then I ended my exam early with about 15 minutes to spare. And then here, I'm just telling you, make sure you understand those 6 scenarios that we just talked about, because each question will be related to a scenario, and they actually show you the scenario in the exam. And then answer everything. You're not penalized for wrong answers. But like I said earlier, 2 hours, I felt 2 hours was really reasonable and enough time to take the exam. Okay, so yeah, so I just explained how I went through that first hour. The second 30 minutes I used to check the ones I flagged, and then a quick pass through. And I keep saying this, any answer that's telling you that it's a prompt-based solution, it's always the wrong answer. And never over engineer a solution. So any answer that's over engineering the solution, it might still solve the problem, but if there's a simpler way to do it, you should always opt for the simple solution. And yeah, this is what I've been saying. You'll see several options that are correct. You can eliminate two, and then you'll be left with the two that you have to decide between. And then always, and I shouldn't have to say this, but always read the entire question fully. Skimming will probably get you in trouble. So read the full question. And then, like I said, you'll eliminate two answers. And then you spend your time trying to figure out between the remaining two which one is the best answer. Okay, so this is the part I'm really trying to get to. Let's take a look at some sample questions and talk through them. So this first question is coming from domain 1. So as we read through this, I want you to drop your answer in the chat before I reveal the answer. So this is scenario 1. Who guarantees that the check runs? So let's say you have an expense approval agent and it has access to tools, verify employee, approve reimbursement, and issue payment. Production data shows that in 15% of the cases, it skips verify employee and approves a reimbursement on the employee's typed name alone. Occasionally, it's paying the wrong person. What would most effectively fix this? So is it answer A, add a programmatic prerequisite that blocks approve reimbursement and issue payment until verify employee has returned a confirmed employee ID? Or is it B, strengthen the system prompt with the explicit emphasized rule that verify employee must be called first? C, add few shot examples to the prompt that consistently show the agent calling verify employee first? Or D, add a routing classifier that inspects each incoming request and enables only the subset of tools appropriate? So do you all think it's A, B, C, or D? If you've been listening, this one should be easy. The answer is A. You want to add that prerequisite gate that makes verification deterministic guarantee. So basically, you're adding that programmatic prerequisite. You're not relying on the prompt. So let's look at a question from domain 2. So you have that support agent, that's one of our scenarios. It has access to search docs and it has access to search tickets. But what's happening, for whatever reason, it keeps calling search docs for questions about a customer's past tickets. What's the most effective first step to improve that tool selection? A, do you add 5 or 8 few shot examples to the prompt? Or B, do you expand each tool's description to spell out what an index is, giving example queries, edge cases? Or C, do you add a routing layer that parses each user message? Or D, do you consolidate search docs and search tickets into one single search all tool? Again, if you've been listening, this should be easy. So what I see a question about what is D. So D is essentially creating a new search all tool that replaces search docs and search tickets. So now instead of having two tools, you have one tool where you can run a search. And so if you've been listening, you'll see the answer is B. Remember, I talked about the way the model determines which tool is the right tool to call is based on the description that you've provided. Question 3. This is from the Claude Code domain. In a large monorepo, database migration files, migration.ts, live inside many different packages, and you want them all to follow one strict convention. And the other code varies by area, but you want Claude to apply this migration convention automatically wherever those database migration files live. How would you do that? A, create a rule file in Claude Rules with YAML front matter that globs all files with the migration.ts extension, matching those files across the whole repo. B, put all of the migration conventions in the root claude.md. C, create a skill called underneath Claude skills that holds your migration conventions. Or D, put a Claude MD file in each package's migrations folder so the conventions live right next to the files they govern. Okay, what do you all think? I see A, D, C, C. Let's see what the answer is. A. So remember the different tools that I mentioned, the built-in tools like read, write, edit, bash, glob. Glob is a tool that lets you search for files by a given pattern. And so for A, it's the glob scoped Claude rules, and you apply it based on a particular file path. Question 4. Valid JSON, wrong value. This is a question from domain 4. So here's the scenario. You extract invoice data with tool use and a JSON schema. The output is always valid JSON, but in 8% of invoices, the vendor tax ID is fabricated or the model hallucinates and makes up that value. It's fabricated when the field is actually missing from the document. What is the most effective fix? A, add an instruction to the prompt telling the model to only extract fields that are actually present. B, make vendor tax ID nullable in the schema so the model returns null when it's absent. C, switch to a larger, more capable model and trust that its stronger extraction won't invent a tax ID. Or D, scrub the output afterward with a regular expression that validates the tax ID format. A, B, C, or D. I see D, I see D, I see C, I see C. All right, let's see. B, a nullable field. Essentially, creating that nullable field allows the model to not know the answer. And so because we've given it permission to, hey, that null is actually okay, it'll choose that as opposed to making up an answer. And this should be the last question coming from domain 5, context and reliability. Great in the demo, wrong in production. So here's the scenario. A support assistant is flawless in short demos, but in long multi-turn chats, it starts contradicting facts that the customer gave it earlier, quoting the wrong order number, forgetting a stated constraint. What is the most effective way to fix this one? A, raise max tokens to the maximum and keep appending the entire conversation transcript on every turn so nothing is ever dropped. B, extract a structured case facts block and resurface it near the end of the context each turn. C, add an instruction telling the model to carefully remember and reread every detail the customer has shared. Or D, summarize the whole conversation into a single running paragraph after each turn and feed that summary back. So A, B, C, or D. I see A. I see D. Let's see. B, a preserved case facts block. That will prevent that or stop that idea. Remember, I told you about the lost in the middle, where think of the analogy you have a child, you tell it 10 things to do. It's only going to remember maybe the first and the last thing you told it. So that is really a good example of some of the thought process and some of the things that you have to know going into the exam. So learn the source. Every answer on the exam will trace back. There are free courses that Anthropic provides that can help prepare you. Build the patterns. So really understand within the exam guide, it gives you certain things that you can build to really understand how all of this works and fits together. And then for number 3, there are practice exams out there. Make sure you take those practice exams. And so these are the 4 exercises that the exam guide calls out. Make sure you know how to build and you've actually done it. A multi-tool agent with escalation, Claude code for a team, a structured extraction pipeline, and a multi-agent research pipeline. So having hands-on building those will really help you going into the exam. And then 4 to 5 weeks out, start to learn the domains. 2 to 3 weeks out, start to think about the scenarios. In your final week of study, take that unofficial practice exam. And then 24 to 48 hours before the exam, just start to review your notes and think about some of the exam strategy techniques that I mentioned. So today was a quick preview of the exam. Like I mentioned at the beginning, Keysoft runs a 5-week cohort that will help you get prepared for the exam. We cover all 6 certification scenarios. We work them end to end. So the cohort, I always like to tell people, it is a build heavy cohort. All of the examples are Python based. And so you get hands-on experience. And there is a full 60-question practice exam that's provided to the cohort. It's meant to simulate how you'll take the exam with Pearson VUE. And then in that cohort, we have weekly live labs. So every Wednesday, I'm live working through a scenario through code. And then Tuesdays and Thursdays, you have hands-on challenges. Monday is the live kickoff, and Friday we have live office hours for 5 weeks. So, and that's that last bullet point, live coaching. You have study groups, so you're working with other cohort members to prepare for the certification exam. So we have one more cohort running this year. It starts on August 24th. If you'd like to apply, just apply at claude.keysoft.tech. And so now, in our last few minutes, if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat. I'll reserve this time. But thank you for spending your time with me today. I'm super excited about just Claude in general. It is just my favorite platform, specifically Claude Code. I use it almost every day, and I always tell people, like, I've been coding for so long, I don't think I'll ever have to write a line of code again, thanks to Claude Code. And so join the cohort here. You'll see it claude.keysoft.tech. If you have an organization and you're trying to bring Claude to your organization, you can go to kickoff.keysoft.tech to sign up for a kickoff, a Kickstart kickoff. And then if you're looking to build real projects with Claude and have real client work, you can check out our residency. So it's residency.keysoft.tech. And then if you're in Atlanta, we have a monthly Claude meetup. It meets the first Wednesday of every month. So just go to meetup.keysoft.tech to learn more about that. Thank you all for your time today. Good luck on the certification exam. And I have a gift for everyone that's attending. I will drop a cheat sheet in the chat. And you can also DM me on LinkedIn to get that free cheat sheet to help you study and prepare for the exam. Well, we are at time. Thank you all for joining today. Good luck on your exam. Bye.